She walked in wearing a faded dress and cloth shoes. They laughed, called her the maid. One cousin even slipped a napkin into her bag that said charity case. But when the will was read, everything changed because the woman they just mocked was the legal wife of the billionaire. And they were being cut off, one by one. And what she did next didn't just silence a room full of heirs. It rewrote everything they thought they knew about power, loyalty, and legacy. Stick around. This isn't just about money. It's about what happens when you judge a simple woman. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Alive Stories. Today's story is about a simple woman who was humiliated at a will reading until she realized she had inherited everything. Let's get started. Nora Langston stepped into the grand drawing room of the Wakefield estate precisely at 9:47 a.m. She wasn't late. She was early, but still. They looked at her like she had crashed a private wedding in sweatpants. Her gray linen dress was worn softly. Her pale blue cardigan hung slightly off one shoulder. Her shoes were flats that had seen years of walking. And the bag, cloth, unbranded, was dangling gently from her arm. The moment she walked in, the air changed. People turned, not with curiosity, with offense. The Wakefield heirs had gathered like lions around a carcass. Champagne is already poured. Diamonds are already flashing. Laughter was already floating across the chandelier-lit room like weaponized smoke. And then her, Nora. Someone audibly scoffed. She didn't see who, but she heard the voice that followed. Did someone forget to lock the staff entrance? A ripple of low laughter rolled through the room. Nora said nothing, just moved toward an empty chair near the back. But the chair wasn't empty for long. A woman in a crimson dress stepped in front of her. Charlotte Wakefield, Preston's sister, third in line to the Wakefield fortune, and first in line to judge anyone not wearing couture. "Oh, honey," Charlotte said, voice dripping with pity so sharp it cut. "This section is for the family. Guests wait outside until the reading's done." Nora met her eyes, calm as fog. "I'm here for the reading." Charlotte blinked, then laughed. "Aren't we all?" Another voice joined in. This one male, theatrical, Trevor Lang, velvet blazer, teeth too white to trust. He strutted over, holding a half-drunk mimosa. "Kitchen staff's meeting is downstairs," he said. "You missed the apron memo." Someone handed Nora a drink menu as if to punctuate the joke. "Breakfast is buffet style," they added. "If you're quick, there might still be scrambled eggs." More laughter. Nora didn't move. She didn't touch the menu. She simply set her cloth bag at her feet and sat. That act, just sitting, stirred the room like a spark dropped on dry leaves. Clara Wakefield was the first to pull out her phone. A social media queen with a skincare brand and a ruthless eye for viral moments. She zoomed in on Nora. #Wakefield will reading. Someone call security before brunch gets awkward. The likes started flowing in. 9:52. Nora was trending in a corner of TikTok reserved for humiliation. People whispered louder now. Smirks hid. One man, Franklin Ward, a cousin once removed, stood and pointed at her across the room. "I'm sorry, Hula let her in. She's not family. She's not on any of the lists. She doesn't belong here." Then came the sentence that turned the air cold. Franklin didn't shout it. He didn't need to. The silence gave his words a microphone. "You don't have the Wakefield name. You don't belong in this room." A pause then, as if the crowd had been waiting for permission. A chorus of murmurs rose. "Exactly. She should leave. She's just here for a handout." Someone went to fetch the staff. But Nora, she didn't move. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She folded her hands in her lap, her spine straight, and her gaze forward. That's when they started getting uncomfortable. A woman in pearls, Marjorie Blake, stepped closer. Voice syrupy but firm. "Dear, you're not on the registry. You're not family. Please wait outside until the formal reading is complete." Nora said nothing, didn't blink, didn't budge. And that's when someone, Charlotte, maybe whispered, "Why isn't she leaving?" Another voice, "Is she deaf?" Another, "Or just desperate?" At that moment, a few staff members stood at the back of the room, watching, unsure of what to do, because no one had officially told them to remove her. And Nora, this plain, quiet woman in linen, just kept sitting there, like she had a right to be there, like she wasn't the joke they were trying to turn her into. Trevor scribbled something on a cocktail napkin, handed it off to Franklin. The two of them laughed, and Franklin walked over and tossed the napkin at her feet. Nora didn't look down, didn't pick it up, didn't give them the satisfaction. By 10:05, the crowd had turned into a swarm. They weren't even talking about Thomas Wakefield anymore. The billionaire, the innovator, the man whose estate they'd come to divide. They were obsessed with the woman in the corner. Who she was. Why wouldn't she leave? Why hadn't the staff escorted her out? Should we call security? Call Arthur. Let the lawyer handle it. But the lawyer hadn't arrived yet, or so they thought, and that was their final mistake. Because while they tore her down in whispers, memes, and condescending glances, she counted every face, every laugh, every insult, and making note, 8 years ago, Nora Langston was invisible. Not in some romantic, metaphorical way. No, she was ignored by the world around her. Just another quiet woman in oversized thrift store sweaters, working 2 jobs, eating soup from a thermos on the bus. She didn't complain. That was the thing about Nora. She endured. At 32, she had buried her mother, lost her apartment, and said goodbye to the last of her stability, all within 3 months. Grief was a weight she carried in silence, tucked under the same cardigan she wore to every interview. Then one Tuesday in March, she walked into a midtown office she hadn't applied to. The listing just said, "Private transcriptionist needed. Must be discreet." That office belonged to Thomas Wakefield, the man whose name was whispered at boardroom tables and printed on the bottom of every national newspaper. Publishing king, Fortune 50 legend, infamous recluse. Nora didn't know any of that. She just needed a job. The waiting room was a museum of silence. Oak panels, black and white portraits, books that looked like they cost more than her car. She sat on the edge of the leather couch, conscious of every thread on her sleeve. When the door opened, she stood. Thomas Wakefield didn't shake hands. He didn't smile. He only looked. Up and down, once. Then he said, "You didn't bring a resume." Nora didn't flinch. "I brought a pen," she replied, holding it up. A beat of silence. Then something unexpected, a nod. Slight, but approving, he gestured for her to come in. That day, Nora transcribed an old contract from the 1980s, by hand, without error. She left after 3 hours, thinking she wouldn't be called again. But the next day, she got a one-word text return, and so she did, day after day, week after week. Her role expanded, from transcription to scheduling, from scheduling to personal correspondence, then international travel, confidential meetings, personal archives, ghostwriting. Still, she never asked about money, never asked for raises, never posted a thing. She simply became essential. Not out loud, just in the way the air shifted when she entered a room. Calm, clear, steady. Thomas noticed. He had assistants before, dozens, but they were ambitious, flashy, hungry. Nora. She listened, remembered, corrected errors quietly, held his silence with care. She became his shadow, and eventually, the only person allowed in his private wing. One rainy night, Thomas asked her a question that changed everything. "Why haven't you asked what I'll leave you?" She looked up from the pages. "I assumed you'd leave me out," she said honestly. He studied her for a long moment. "That's why I won't." By then, his health had begun to falter, a diagnosis of early onset Parkinson's. Most didn't know. Nora did. She adjusted his schedule, found the specialists, learned his meds, became his memory when his hands shook too hard to write. Still, she never moved into the mansion. She slept in a modest studio, rode the train to work, cooked for herself, sent Christmas cards to the same neighbors who thought she had disappeared. She was there the night he drafted the final will. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten. He made her read it back 3 times. Each time, he nodded slowly. Then he said, "Let them show their teeth. You'll know who's who." He smiled at her. "You've been invisible for so long." Nora. But that's about to end. Before he died, they made recordings, letters, instructions for the estate's legal team. Everything was timed down to the second. He asked her to disappear for 6 months. No contact, no posts, no interviews. Let them assume, let them mock, let them underestimate, then walk in and do nothing. That's all she asked. That's everything, he replied. Nora followed every word. She waited in silence as tabloids speculated. She listened as Wakefield's board scrambled to prepare for asset division. And she arrived at the will reading exactly 1 minute early, with no entourage, no makeup, and one cloth bag on her shoulder. The stares didn't shake her. The jokes didn't scratch. She had walked through worse, and now she was walking into the storm. Calm, certain, confidently aware none of them knew she was the reason why they were about to lose everything. The door to the drawing room closed with a heavy thud, signaling the end of the pretense. People returned to their chairs, champagne warming in their glasses, postures stiffening. Even the laughter grew thin, stretched over unease. Nora Langston still hadn't moved. She sat at the far end of the room, eyes forward, hands in her lap, as if the accusations had bounced off her like pebbles on steel. But that only made them angrier. "Who even is she?" Clara hissed. "She hasn't said a word since she got here," Preston muttered. "I don't like it," Marjorie added. "It's disrespectful. If she were decent, she'd excuse herself." No one did anything. They were all waiting for someone else to handle it. That someone arrived at 10:15 on the dot. Arthur Halverson, the Wakefield family's estate attorney of 27 years, dressed in a perfectly pressed charcoal suit and shoes that never made a sound on marble. He stepped to the front, placed his briefcase on the table, and opened it with the elegance of a man used to holding power without raising his voice. The room fell silent. Arthur didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. He looked around, his gaze sweeping over each person like a ledger being mentally calculated. When he reached Nora, he paused for a fraction of a second and returned to his folder. Charlotte caught that, so did Preston. Their spines straightened. Something was off. Arthur cleared his throat. "Good morning. Thank you all for coming. We are here today to read the final will of Mr. Thomas Everett Wakefield, dated 5 years before his disappearance and verified as authentic by the state registrar and 2 independent witnesses." He paused, letting the words settle. No one moved. Arthur continued, his tone even. "I understand emotions are high, that's expected. But before we begin, let me remind everyone that any attempt to disrupt this reading will result in immediate removal. You are not legally entitled to a discussion, only to a hearing." He looked up, eyes sharp. And this is it. The legalese was lost on most. All they wanted was the prize. The properties, the patents, the assets are locked in overseas vaults and Delaware trusts. They wanted the empire Thomas Wakefield had built, and assumed they had earned it by blood, or at least by proximity. Arthur pulled out a sealed envelope, broke the wax with a silver letter opener, and began to read. "I, Thomas Everett Wakefield, being of sound mind and body, hereby declare this my final will." Nora didn't blink. She already knew every word. Arthur continued, "To my immediate family, friends, and business partners gathered here today, I leave no apologies or explanations behind. Only the truth." A ripple moved through the room. "To those who stood by me for what I could give them, I leave you nothing." A beat. Dead silence. Arthur didn't look up. "To those who sought my name more than my character, who counted their inheritance before my funeral, I leave you no keys, titles, or legacy." People began shifting in their seats. Clara's mouth hung open. Preston looked like he'd swallowed a shard of glass. Arthur kept going. "To the woman who stood by me when I was no one, who asked for nothing, who protected my name more fiercely than those who shared it, I leave everything." He folded the letter. Silence. Absolute. Then, a breath, a whisper. Who the hell is he talking about? And then Arthur said the name. "To my legal wife, Nora Langston." The sound was a gut punch wrapped in silk. Gasps. Chairs scraping. Someone dropped a glass. Clara turned sharply in her seat. Wife Charlotte stood up. "That's a joke." Preston half laughed. "That woman, that thing, sitting it back there. She doesn't even have the name Wakefield." Marjorie snapped. "This is fraud," Trevor said, pointing. "That woman is not his wife." Arthur raised a hand. "Documents are verified. Marriage certificate, witness statements, co-owned bank accounts, video evidence." "I want to see it," Clara shouted. Show us the proof. Arthur reached into his briefcase, pulled a USB, and nodded toward the AV assistant in the corner. A projector hummed to life. The room dimmed. The footage was grainy, but clear. Thomas Wakefield, 7 years younger, at a courthouse in Vermont, standing beside a woman in a simple white dress. Nora, smiling, holding his hand, kissing him softly before a justice of the peace. Two witnesses in frame, a nurse and a librarian, date stamped, time stamped, certified. The room was breathtaking. Even Marjorie's pearls seemed to shrink. When the lights came back on, Nora stood, not to gloat, not to speak, just to be seen, to make it impossible to look away. She strolled, deliberately, toward the front of the room. Preston stepped back like she was radioactive. Arthur gestured to the chair beside him. Nora sat, like she had every right to be there. Because she did. That's when the screaming began. She tricked him. She seduced him. She's a liar. She doesn't belong here. But it was too late. Everything they thought was theirs was hers, and they had mocked her to her face, in full view of the only person whose opinion mattered. Not Arthur, not even Thomas, but the camera. When she walked in, Nora knew the room was being recorded. The room was coming apart, not from volume, but from the collapse of the assumption. And at the center of it was a woman in linen, in flats, in silence, still, unmoving, and entirely in control. The air in the drawing room turned heavier than marble. Nora Langston sat beside Arthur Halverson like a storm, silently in the eye of chaos. No screaming, no gloating, just presence. And somehow, that shook them more than if she'd stood up and shouted. Clara was the first to break. She stood, palms open, voice high with desperation. "This can't be real," she said, trembling. He didn't even tell us he was married." Preston stepped forward, too, his finger pointed at Arthur. "You expect us to believe he married a woman who shops at thrift stores and didn't even take his name?" Arthur didn't blink. "You don't have to believe it. You just have to live with it." The words landed like a closed vault. Nora hadn't said a word since the video ended. She didn't need to. Because every inch of the room, the dripping chandeliers, the gilded mirrors, the velvet chairs, had turned against those who mocked her. Charlotte Wakefield leaned against the mantel. Her expression cracked. "She planned this," she whispered. "She let us make fools of ourselves." Arthur cleared his throat. "She didn't have to let you. You did that on your own. The inheritance papers were authentic. The signatures had been verified. The marriage license was sealed in the Vermont registry. The witnesses were contacted, available. Thomas Wakefield had rewritten his entire will for one reason, to test the character of the people who claimed to love him most. And they'd failed. Spectacularly. "Where's the rest of it?" Marjorie snapped. "The estate can't go to just one person." Arthur removed a second envelope from the folder. "There is an addendum, executed 2 weeks before Mr. Wakefield's presumed death." He unfolded the pages, then read, "To any individual who mocks, humiliates, or mistreats my wife at the time of my passing, whether publicly or privately, your claim to any part of my estate is revoked in full." A pause. Arthur glanced up. "You were all recorded." Gasps scattered like shattered porcelain. Nora finally stood. Slowly, she stepped forward, past the rows of frozen faces. Her voice came softly but crisply. "You laughed when you thought I was beneath you." She looked at Preston. "You sneered when you thought I was invisible." Her eyes turned to Clara. "You used my face for followers. Now you'll remember it for everything you lost." She stopped at the center of the room. "You believed your name made you worthy." "It didn't, a beat. I didn't come here to gloat. I came to watch the truth speak for itself." Trevor scoffed, arms crossed. "What truth?" "That you tricked a dying man." Nora turned. "No, I loved him when none of you cared who he was when the cameras were off." Her voice didn't rise. Her body didn't move. But the weight in her words made the entire room shrink. Charlotte muttered. "What are we supposed to do now?" Arthur replied, not looking up from the will. "Leave." Quietly, one by one. They stood. Some protested. Others begged. Most simply went pale. Clara tried to grab Arthur's arm. "This isn't fair. I didn't know who she was." Arthur looked at her, unblinking. And you didn't care. Security waited by the door. Marjorie clutched her purse like it was life itself. Thomas wouldn't do this, she whispered. Nora looked at her. He did because he saw you, all of you, when the last of them filed out, defeated, exposed, humiliated. Nora remained standing. Her bag still sat unshaken and straightforward at the edge of her chair. Arthur turned to her, eyes softer now. You handled that with grace, he said. I didn't need revenge, Nora replied. Just clarity, he nodded. There's one more thing you should know. He reached into the folder and handed her a final document, a handwritten letter. The envelope read only for Nora. She took it quietly. Her fingers were trembling just once. Arthur stepped away, giving her space. She didn't open the letter yet. Instead, she looked out over the now empty room. All the wealth, all the legacy, all the cruelty, gone, and the silence it left behind beautiful. The hall was nearly empty now. Gone were the voices soaked in entitlement, the smirks, the polished cruelty disguised as small talk. All that remained were half-finished glasses of champagne, abandoned handbags, and chairs turned at odd angles, like a battlefield frozen mid-retreat. Nora Langston stood alone in the center of it. Her cardigan was still slipping off one shoulder. Her cloth bag was still resting quietly against the leg of her chair. No throne, no crown, just stillness. And truth. Arthur Halverson re-entered with a stack of formal documents under one arm. Everything's ready, he said quietly. The transfer paperwork, asset access, property controls, account migration. She didn't take them immediately. Instead, she looked around at the gilded walls, the portraits of Wakefield's past. The 18th century fireplace was carved from imported Italian marble. And then she asked, how long until the press finds out? Arthur blinked. An hour, maybe two. There were phones out. Someone's already leaked. Nora nodded slowly. Let them come. A soft knock came at the side door. It opened just a crack. A woman in her mid-60s peeked in, flushed, nervous. It was Linda, the housekeeper. She'd served Thomas Wakefield for over 30 years. Ma'am, she asked gently. Nora smiled. You don't have to call me that. Linda. But Linda stepped in, wiping her hands on her apron. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what they said to you. I knew Thomas had someone. He was different around you. I just didn't know it was real. Nora's voice was warm. He always said you were the one who made this house feel like a home. Linda blushed. Well, it's nice to see someone with a heart finally own it. Then, before she turned to leave, she said one more thing. I'm glad it's you. Outside the grand windows, the press had begun to arrive. Camera vans lined the drive. Drones hovered, their faint hums barely audible beneath the quiet tension inside. Arthur turned to Nora. You'll be asked to make a statement. You don't have to do it now, but the world will want to hear your side. Nora thought for a long time. Then finally, not yet. Arthur nodded. She picked up the letter Thomas had left her, slipped it into her bag without opening it. Not yet. Not until everything else was settled. There was one last thing she needed to do. One last legacy she had to set right. She walked toward the massive double doors at the end of the hall, doors that had always been closed to her. Until now. She opened them. Inside was the Wakefield boardroom, 24 leather chairs, a long glass table, walls lined with framed newspaper clippings, business awards, and original patent sketches. She stepped inside. Every step was a declaration, not of victory, but on arrival. Arthur followed a few steps behind. They'll try to challenge it, he warned. Preston, Clara, the rest. They'll drag you through the court of public opinion. Nora nodded. Let them. Arthur's brow raised slightly. She continued. They mocked a woman with nothing but a linen dress and dignity. Now they have neither. That's their legacy, not mine. She sat at the head of the table, not because she wanted the power, but because no one else deserved it. And because Thomas had built this empire on vision, Nora would rebuild it on values. A phone rang. Arthur's. He answered, listened briefly, then looked at Nora. They want an interview, CNN, this afternoon. She shook her head. Let them speculate a little longer. What should I tell them? She smiled faintly. Tell them this: the Wakefield fortune belongs to someone who earned nothing, but chose to give everything back in kindness. Arthur blinked, surprised. You're giving it away, Nora shrugged. Not all, but most. Thomas always said legacy was what people whispered when they thought no one was listening. Outside, the first flashbulbs went off. A new story was being written, and it began with a woman called a nobody by a room full of people who had just lost everything. The world had already changed when the sun descended behind the Wakefield Hills, not because of an empire passed down, but because of the way it was passed, and who stood at the center of that storm. Utterly unshaken, Nora Langston stood by the front steps of the Wakefield estate. The cameras had arrived, the reporters with microphones, the drones circling like moths around a porch light. But Nora didn't speak, not yet. She stood beside Arthur Halverson, flanked by the estate's legal counsel and a few quiet staff members who, for the first time, looked at her not with confusion, but with reverence. She wasn't just the woman from the back row anymore. She was Mrs. Wakefield, and every headline in the country now knew it. They didn't know she'd already set most of the fortune in motion. A private medical fund in Thomas's name for uninsured children, a grant for working-class women returning to school after 35. The groundskeeper, Anna, had just learned she'd been made the official steward of the estate gardens, lifetime salary, health care, her choice of cottage. And Linda, the longtime housekeeper, was now the director of the Wakefield Foundation's housing initiative. The press wanted spectacle. They got silence. And in that silence, Nora's dignity said more than any podium ever could. But later that night, when the lights were off and the last car had pulled away, Nora sat alone in the grand library, just her, the fire, and the unopened letter. She stared at it for a long time before finally unfolding the page. Thomas's handwriting, always slightly slanted, always exacting. Nora, if you're reading this, I finally got to do what I always told you to, and make the world see you like I always did. You gave me life when I had nothing but wealth. They'll come at you with claws, but you're made of steel wrapped in softness. They won't see it coming. Don't fight them. Outlast them. I love you. Always. T. She folded the letter, gently, deliberately, then tucked it back into her bag. A week later, the tabloids had moved on, but something had shifted. In boardrooms, in family estates, in back-channel trust funds, in high-net-worth legal circles. A lesson had echoed louder than any inheritance. Underestimate no one, especially not the quiet woman in the corner. And Nora. She never wore pearls. She never spoke on panels. She never wrote a memoir. She didn't need to. She'd already written something better. A legacy, not in dollars, but in dignity. Some people walk into a room and expect the world to kneel. Others walk in quietly and change everything without saying a word. If this story meant something to you, share it, because somewhere out there, another woman is being underestimated, and she deserves to know she's not alone. A simple woman was humiliated at a will reading until they realized she inherited everything. Power doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it sits still until everyone else runs out of noise. Thank you for watching the story of Nora Langston, the woman who silenced an entire room of power, not with wealth, but with dignity. If this story made you pause and reflect, hit that like button, share the video with a friend, and drop a comment about a time you were underestimated or witnessed someone rise above humiliation. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the following inspiring story. Because absolute power doesn't lie in what you own. It lies in how you stand your ground when the world tries to knock you down. See you in the following video.